Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. Norway chess has begun. This is a really strong tournament. Magnus Carlsen is playing and some of the leading players in the world. And I'm going to show you a game from round one between Viswanathan Anand and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Anand, 52 years old. Can he still cut it at the top of the chess scene? This game is a real contrast with the previous video that I showed on this channel. I was looking at an old game of Bent Larsen's where he was sacrificing pawns, played a slightly dubious opening, but it all came good spectacularly. With Anand, we see something very different. So no open Sicilian. Of course, in the past, with White, in his best years, he was an absolute killer with the open Sicilian with 3d4, but in his old age he's playing bishop b5 check, so that's much calmer. And Vachier-Lagrave goes for, you could say, the traditional main line, just exchanging pieces. Very sensible. Now Anand goes for c4. You can castle there, that's possible. But c4 is the very solid move. You play for this so-called Marozzi bind. I mean, black can play e5 here to stop white playing d4, but it does give away some control. If e5, it gives some control away over the d5 square. So knight f6 is the normal move. And then we get this standard so-called Marozzi bind position with the pawns on c4 and e4. So these pawns cramp black in the center. It used to be thought this was, this gave white a very clear advantage, but these days we kind of understand how to hit out with black. Now it's possible to play very solidly with e6, but g6 is reckoned to be the way to go, and white needs to support this knight with the bishop, so therefore f3. You play that first in order to prevent knight g4, so bishop g7, bishop e3, and both sides castle, and this is such a standard position. a6, so this eventually prepares the break with b5. This is such an important move in breaking down white's control in the center. If you can successfully get in b5, then black is absolutely fine. And I mean, this position has been reached in literally hundreds of games. And the most popular move here is a4, a very logical move to, just cramp black and prevent b5. The only thing is, when you play a4, it can leave, these squares a bit weaker, and generally black does okay against that. But Anand plays knight b3, and this is a novelty. As I said, hundreds of games have been played from this position, but, well, according to my database, this has never been tried before. So what's Anand doing? Going out on a limb? Well, if you feed this position into one of the latest versions of Stockfish, then it quite likes knight b3. It's not the first line move, it's about the second line, but it's definitely a Stockfish suggestion. So I think from this we can see that Vichy has done his homework. Stockfish. So what's the point of knight b3? Well, first of all, it prevents an immediate exchange of pieces. Well, that's good. So that if black has more pieces on the board, then that means black is a little bit more cramped. Is playing behind the first three ranks. I mean, it's not that serious, but that's one thing. But also sometimes it can be useful for white to actually play c5. So for example, if black were to attack this pawn here. Then c5 is quite nice, opens up the position, attacks the queen, and white is a little bit better in that position. So e6 played. That probably has to be played at some point to cover the d5 square. Queen e2, and the queen just edges to the side just to get out of the way of the d file. And rook c1. So both sides just bring their rooks into the middle. It's all very regular. Now Anand brings the knight back to d4. You don't necessarily have to do this, but that's what he did. And actually, it's possible to break with d5 here. I mean, this is also a typical break. But I mean, maybe Vachier-Lagrave didn't particularly like this position, because the knight has to go back and there's a blockade. But black should be all right here after f6. Black has enough play. Anyway, after knight d4, he played knight d7, which is sort of typical maneuver in these kind of positions. This knight might leap out here, but also it opens up the bishop. b3, super solid. For the moment, Anand just keeping that structure absolutely secure. And here is where Vachier-Lagrave lashes out. It's not easy to do, but at this point, perhaps a more secure way of playing, more solid way of playing, is just to exchange some pieces and bring the knight back. You can also get the queen out, but you can bring the knight back and sit there, basically. It's difficult to do that. As black in these kind of positions, you're never sure whether to break or whether to sit there. And probably he felt that he didn't want a kind of passive position, particularly against Anand, who is very, very good at squeezing positionally. But instead of that, he lashed out with b5. Anand took this. Exchange of pieces in the middle, and then a takes b5. So, as I said before, this b5 break is very typical because it breaks down white's center, also opens up the c file. You'll notice there's a pin here, so white has to be very careful indeed, and there can even be a second break coming with d5. But here Anand plays excellently. So instead of taking that pawn, he plays queen d2, so that protects the rook. Very good. So that's all about coordination. Everything is protected, and there's even some pressure here. And here Vachier-Lagrave decides to protect this pawn with rook b8. Might have been better to play knight f6, but certainly white should be better in these kind of positions. White is a pawn up, but here's the point. Black can break with d5 and get some kind of counterplay. I think, if black manages to get a hit against the king, this can be interesting. White still has the better chances, but still, it's complicated. But after rook b8, Vachier-Lagrave was trying to, get some play with this move, and certainly if knight a4, then knight b6, that trades pieces quite nicely, and black should be fine in that position. Normally, with just heavy pieces on the board, there's less danger, and black should be able to draw that. But correctly, Anand doesn't play here, but brings the knight back, which looks a little passive, but actually just holds everything. And after knight e5, rook d1, protecting this rook here. Knight came back to c6 to protect the rook. And here is where Anand starts to play really accurately. This is not an easy position to handle at all, but he does brilliantly here. Okay, well, I'll hand it over to you. I'll have a quick slurp of tea. You have a quick think. What should white play in this position? There's really only one move that guarantees white the advantage here. So, cheers, morning cuppa. Well, there are plenty of ways to get it wrong. King h1 would, which feels natural to take the king away from this diagonal, but actually that would lose to rook takes rook and rook d8, a very unfortunate skewer. Okay, what else we got? We've got rook takes rook, queen e1, yes, that doesn't lose anything, but after this, see that unfortunate check, and black recovers the pawn, and that's equal. The best move here, which Anand played, is e5. Excellent. Of course, that can't be taken because the rook can be taken here. Queen check. King h1. And this looks really scary. You know, suddenly the queen is in the heart of white's position. And yeah, this is really not so simple. But again, Anand comes up with an excellent move. Rook c1, very good. Attacking the knight. And of course, if the knight moves, then rook takes rook again. So the rook has to be taken, and now white has this dangerous passed pawn on d6. Knight e5. I mean, this is still something of an issue. White has to be very careful here. So h3, so that just gives the king an escape square, can be useful sometimes, but also takes that square away from the knight. I mean, this is a really accurate move, and actually threatens in some positions to play f4, attacking the knight, and it won't be able to come in here. Anand had to work out that this actually comes to nothing. After this, well, in fact, it might be possible to sort of give the odd check, but the king is going to run away. And after d7, actually white is winning. So h3 played. Rook b5. f4, very accurate. You see, you've got to be careful. That rook, in some circumstances, could threaten to come across the board, but f4 is really strong. If knight f3, this is nice. The best move is d7. So we know that Vichy is such a speedy and accurate calculator, and he would have seen that this little sequence just leaves him a piece up. Very nice. So f4, hitting the knight, which drops back to d7. Again, another move which is spot on. White needs to simplify this position. The queen is very powerful on f2. It's causing white problems there. So queen d4, great move. What happens on queen takes knight? So this is very sweet. Takes, and that's checkmate. Very nice tic-tacs. Okay, so that means that black has to exchange queens. Nice simplification. So now white is a pawn up. Still needs to steer it home to victory. Knight c6, good move. Still a pawn up, so now white has two connected passed pawns on the queen side. Now they're a long way from touchdown, so still got to play accurately, but only takes a couple of moves, and this one is flying. e5. Vachier-Lagrave trying to find some counterplay. Rook c5. This is another really strong move. Just causes some embarrassment here. That knight doesn't really have a good square to go to. So for example, if knight d7, then rook d5 forces another trade, and white is just simplifying down to a winning endgame. In the game, rook d1 check, and now the knight was supported with f6, but actually this has fatal consequences in a few moves. Watch what happens. a4, so the pawn starts to march. Rook b1, attacking this one. Rook c3, protecting rook a1. Now, after Anand's next move, black resigned. So what was Vichy's last move? White to play. Rook c7. That's why f6 has fatal consequences, because now black's king is trapped on the back rank. And the threat is knight to d5. So Anand is holding these pawns, but now knight d5 threatens to come in to win a second pawn. So for example, f5, knight d5, king here. Well, you can play knight f6, but rook h7. Here, I mean, you can try and trap the rook in, but the rook bounces out and can come back, and then the pawns are slowly going to shuffle down the board. I think this game just shows what a class act Vichy is. Well, first of all, his preparation was excellent. Not that this gave white some kind of decisive advantage, far from it. I mean, you could say it's another little wrinkle in this opening. I don't think black is significantly worse here at all. But it forced Vachier-Lagrave to think a little, and he didn't get it quite right and misjudged things with b5. But then after that, Anand's play was accurate. So accurate. And when it came to technique, you know, finding moves like e5 and then finding how to simplify at every turn, rook c1, and then a really nice move, queen d4. This is all brilliant stuff. Anand makes it look very simple. It really isn't. This was a really smooth game from a player whose technique is superb. More coming your way from Norway Chess very soon. And those that support me on Patreon, your extra videos and newsletter with the test game will be arriving shortly over the next couple of days. Thanks for watching.